Welcome to episode 3, where we continue to explore the history of the Shona peoples, focusing on the Chimurenga Uprising, 1896 to 1897. But before that, let's address the elephant in the room. What are the origins of the name Shona? To answer this question, we need to go way back in time. Zimbabwe is a land of many cultures, and the most dominant cultural traits are those associated with the Shona-speaking peoples, the majority. Let's begin with the Stone Age of hunters and gatherers, the San, from as far back as 200 BC. The San were later displaced by Bantu-speaking peoples, the ancestors of the present-day Shona-speaking people in Zimbabwe. In the early 19th century, we saw the Ndebele people arriving and settling in Matabeleland. Their major urban center is Bulawayo. Including the Gaza-Nguni, who settled in the southeastern regions of the country, intermarried with the local Shona population to produce the group we know today as the Ndau ethnic group. The origins of the name Shona have been the subject of much debate among historians, linguists, and anthropologists. The term Shona is used to describe a group of Bantu-speaking people who not only live in present-day Zimbabwe, as well as parts of Mozambique, Botswana, and South Africa. Pre-colonial usage. The term Shona was not widely used by the people it describes before the colonial era. Instead, the Shona identified themselves by their specific clans, chiefdoms, or dialects, such as the Karanga, Zezuru, Manyika, Ndau, and Korekore. The name Shona likely originated from external sources, possibly from neighboring groups or early European explorers and missionaries. Possible linguistic origins. Nguni influence. One theory suggests that the name Shona derives from the Nguni word Shona, which means to disappear or to vanish. This could refer to the Shona practice of building stone-walled settlements like Great Zimbabwe, which seemed to disappear into the landscape when viewed from a distance. Sotho-Tswana influence. Another theory links the name to the Sotho-Tswana word Shona, meaning to destroy or to finish. This might have been used by neighboring groups to describe the Shona's military prowess or their ability to resist external threats. Colonial adoption and standardization. The term Shona was popularized and standardized during the colonial era by European missionaries, administrators, and anthropologists. They needed a collective term to describe the various related Bantu-speaking groups in the region. Missionaries like Reverend John White and Reverend A. Lowe played a significant role in promoting the use of Shona to describe the people and their language. This was part of their efforts to create a unified identity for evangelization and administrative purposes. The colonial government adopted the term for census records and administrative classification, further entrenching its use. Academic and political usage. In the early 20th century, scholars like Clement Doak and Michael Hannon began using Shona to describe the language and culture of the people in the region. Their work helped standardize the term in academic circles. During the nationalist movements of the mid-20th century, the term Shona was embraced as a unifying identity for the majority ethnic group in Zimbabwe. It became a symbol of cultural pride and resistance against colonial rule. Modern usage today, Shona is widely accepted as the name for the largest ethnic group in Zimbabwe, comprising about 80% of the population. It also refers to the Shona language, which includes several dialects such as Karanga, Zezuru, Manyika, Ndau, and Korekore. The name has become a key part of Zimbabwean national identity, particularly in contrast to the Ndebele, the second largest ethnic group in the country. Criticisms and controversies. Some scholars and cultural activists argue that the term Shona is a colonial construct that oversimplifies the diversity of the people it describes. They emphasize the importance of recognizing the distinct identities of the various Shona subgroups. Others point out that the term was initially imposed by outsiders and may not fully capture the historical and cultural nuances of the people. In brief, the origins of the name Shona are rooted in external influences, particularly from neighboring groups and colonial authorities. While the term was not widely used by the people themselves before the colonial era, it has since become a central part of their identity. Today, Shona refers to both a people and a language, symbolizing unity and cultural heritage in Zimbabwe. However, its history as a colonial construct reminds us of the complexities and diversity within the Shona community. Having that clarification now out of the way, it's high time we focused on the subject of our talk today, the Chimurenga Uprising. It was a major rebellion against British colonial rule in Zimbabwe. It took place between 1896 and 1897 and was a response to the oppressive policies of the British South Africa Company BSAC, which had colonized the region. In episode 2, we touched on the British occupation following the arrival of Cecil John Rhodes' sponsored pioneer column in 1890. This was followed by a gradual expansion of a white settler population, the development of an economy largely based on mining, agriculture, and manufacturing, which took advantage of cheap African labor. Let's take a look at the events leading to the Chimurenga Uprising, British colonization, and the BSAC. In 1890, the British South Africa Company, BSAC, led by Cecil John Rhodes, established control over Mashonaland, Shona territory, and Matabeleland, Ndebele territory, through deceptive treaties like the Rudd Concession, 1888, and the Royal Charter, 1889. The BSAC imposed harsh policies, including land dispossession, forced labor, and heavy taxation, which disrupted the traditional livelihoods of the Shona and Ndebele. They made numerous demands that the locals found intolerable. Why did the colonists introduce taxes? The colonial administration imposed a variety of taxes to raise revenue to fund its colonial administration, also as a way to force African males into the European labor market of mine and farming. These taxes were paid as cash, livestock, or labor. For example, the hut tax of 1893, a dog tax, and a tax on wives in excess of one. Native departments were created in 1895 to collect these taxes. In the event that the white settlers failed to reach their targets, they resorted to the use of force. Loss of land and livelihood. Loss of ancestral land. The British South Africa Company, BSAC, confiscated large tracts of fertile land from the Shona to allocate to European settlers. Forced relocation. Shona people were often moved to less fertile and overcrowded reserves where they struggled to sustain themselves. This dispossession disrupted traditional farming practices and displaced many Shona communities. Forced labor and exploitation. The Shona and Ndebele were forced to work on European-owned farms and mines under exploitative conditions, often for little or no pay. The land grabbing dispossessed the indigenous people of their land, turning them into squatters and farm laborers. Often the locals were simply driven away or were told they had to do certain services if they would like to continue to make gardens on their old place, leaving the locals wondering who gave them that land. Hut taxes. The British imposed hut taxes, which required Shona families to pay in cash. Since the Shona had little access to money, they were forced to work on European-owned farms, mines, and infrastructure projects to earn the necessary funds. Harsh working conditions. Labor conditions were brutal, with long hours, low pay, and little regard for workers' well-being. Many Shona people were treated as little more than slaves. Disruption of traditional livelihoods. Forced labor prevented the Shona from tending to their own farms and herds, leading to food shortages and economic hardship. Land as identity land was not just an economic resource for the Shona, but also a central part of their cultural and spiritual identity. Dispossession was seen as an attack on their way of life and connection to their ancestors. Cultural and spiritual disruption. The arrival of European missionaries and colonial administrators undermined traditional Shona and Ndebele spiritual and cultural practices. The imposition of Christianity and European laws alienated many people from their ancestral customs and beliefs. The British colonial administration undermined the authority of Shona chiefs and spiritual leaders, replacing them with colonial-appointed officials. This eroded the traditional social and political structures of Shona society. Missionary activity. Christian missionaries sought to convert the Shona, often dismissing their traditional beliefs and practices as backward or pagan. This cultural imperialism alienated many Shona people from their spiritual heritage. Desecration of sacred sites. European settlers and missionaries sometimes destroyed or desecrated sacred sites, such as shrines and burial grounds, further angering the Shona. Economic exploitation. The British South Africa Company monopolized trade and resources, leaving the Shona and Ndebele impoverished. Also, preventing the Shona from engaging in independent economic activities and forcing them to rely on European-controlled markets. The introduction of hut taxes forced people to work for Europeans to earn money, further entrenching their dependence on the colonial system. The British exploited the region's natural resources, particularly gold, for their own benefit, with little regard for the well-being of the Shona people. Inequality and poverty. The colonial economy created stark inequalities, with Europeans enjoying wealth and privilege while the Shona lived in poverty. Violence and brutality, punitive expeditions. The British often used violence to enforce their rule, launching punitive expeditions against Shona communities that resisted colonial policies. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and people killed or imprisoned. Disrespect for Shona customs. The British showed little respect for Shona customs and traditions, often treating the Shona as inferior and uncivilized. Loss of sovereignty, erosion of independence. The Shona had historically lived in autonomous chiefdoms, but British colonization stripped them of their independence and subjected them to foreign rule. Deceptive Treaties. The Shona resented the way the British used deceptive treaties, such as the Rudd Concession 1888, to justify their colonization. These treaties were often signed without the full understanding or consent of the Shona people. This led to the First Matabele War 1893 to 1894, which was a conflict between the Ndebele Kingdom, Matabeleland, and the British South Africa Company, BSAC, led by Cecil John Rhodes. The war marked the beginning of British colonial dominance in present-day Zimbabwe and led to the downfall of the Ndebele Kingdom under King Lobengula. Let me give you a detailed account of the causes, key events, and consequences of the First Matabele War. Starting with the background and causes of the war, British ambitions in southern Africa. Cecil Rhodes, the founder of the BSAC, sought to expand British influence and control over southern Africa, particularly in regions rich in gold and other resources. Rhodes used deceptive treaties such as Rudd Concession, 1888, to claim legitimacy for his colonization efforts. The concession granted the BSAC exclusive mining rights in Ndebele territory, but Lobengula later claimed he was misled about its terms. Tensions between the Ndebele and Shona. The Ndebele had historically raided Shona communities for cattle, grain, and captives. The Shona, who were not unified, often suffered under Ndebele dominance. The BSAC exploited these tensions, portraying themselves as protectors of the Shona to justify their intervention in the region. The Jameson raid and provocations, Leander Starr Jameson, Rhodes's close associate and the BSAC administrator, deliberately provoked the Ndebele to create a pretext for war. In 1893, a series of incidents, including the killing of Ndebele warriors by BSAC forces, escalated tensions. Jameson used these incidents to argue that the Ndebele pose a threat to European settlers and the Shona. I'm going to focus only on the key events of the war outbreak of war, October 1893. The war began in October 1893 when BSAC forces, supported by Shona auxiliaries and European settlers, launched an offensive against the Ndebele Kingdom. The BSAC had superior firepower, including Maxim guns, early machine guns, which gave them a significant advantage over the Ndebele, who relied on traditional weapons like spears and shields. The Battle of Shangani, October 25th, 1893, one of the first major battles of the war, the Battle of Shangani, saw BSAC forces defeat the Ndebele army. The Ndebele warriors, despite their bravery, were no match for the BSAC's modern weapons. The Ndebele suffered heavy casualties, while the BSAC forces sustained minimal losses. The burning of Bulawayo. As BSAC forces advanced toward the Ndebele capital, Bulawayo Lobengula ordered the city to be burned to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. The Ndebele retreated northward, hoping to regroup and continue the fight. The Shangani Patrol, December 1893. In December 1893, a BSAC patrol led by Major Allen Wilson pursued Lobengula into the bush. The patrol was ambushed by Ndebele forces, and all members, including Wilson, were killed. This event became known as the Shangani Patrol and was later romanticized as a heroic last stand by the British. Lobengula's death and the end of the war. Lobengula fled Bulawayo and died under mysterious circumstances in early 1894, possibly from illness or poisoning. His death marked the collapse of organized Ndebele resistance. The BSAC declared victory and established control over Matabeleland. What were the consequences of the war? Fall of the Ndebele Kingdom. The Ndebele Kingdom, once a powerful and centralized state, was dismantled. The BSAC confiscated Ndebele cattle and land, redistributing them to European settlers. The Ndebele people were forced to live in reserves and subjected to harsh colonial rule. Expansion of British control. The BSAC extended its control over Mashonaland, Shona territory, and Matabeleland, consolidating its hold on present-day Zimbabwe. The war paved the way for further colonization and exploitation of the region's resources, particularly gold. Inspiration from the Ndebele Uprising, Ndebele resistance, the Ndebele, who had also suffered under British rule, launched their own uprising in March 1896. Their initial successes inspired the Shona to join the rebellion in June 1896, creating a united front against the colonial forces. Shared grievances, both the Shona and Ndebele shared similar grievances, including land dispossession, forced labor, and cultural disruption, which fueled their collective resistance. What was the impact on the Shona? While the Shona initially welcomed the BSAC as liberators from Ndebele raids, they soon realized that British rule was equally oppressive. The Shona had initially hoped to benefit from the Ndebele's defeat, but soon realized that they too would suffer under British rule. The First Matabele War sowed the seeds of future resistance. The Ndebele and Shona would later unite in the Chimurenga Uprising 1896 to 1897 to fight against British colonial rule. The outbreak of the Chimurenga Uprising 1896, what sparked the war? In March 1896, the Ndebele rose up against the British South Africa Company, marking the beginning of the Chimurenga Uprising. The Shona joined the rebellion in June 1896, creating a united front against the colonial forces. The immediate trigger for the uprising was the widespread resentment of colonial rule, combined with a belief in the spiritual power of ancestral spirits to drive out the Europeans. The role of spiritual leaders. The Shona's resentment was further galvanized by their spiritual leaders, such as Nehanda Nyakasikana and Kaguvi, who framed the struggle as a spiritual war against colonial oppression. These leaders invoked the power of ancestral spirits to inspire and unite the people, promised that the ancestors would protect the Shona and ensure victory over the British, provided moral and strategic guidance, reinforcing the legitimacy of the uprising. The uprising was deeply rooted in the spiritual beliefs of the Shona and Ndebele. Spiritual mediums, believed to be possessed by ancestral spirits, played a central role in mobilizing and inspiring the people. Nehanda Nyakasikana and Kaguvi were two of the most prominent spiritual leaders during the uprising. The roles of Nehanda Nyakasikana and Kaguvi. Who was Nehanda Nyakasikana? Nehanda was a powerful spirit medium associated with the Shona people. She was believed to be possessed by the spirit of Nyamika, a revered ancestral figure. Her role in the uprising, Nehanda played a key role in uniting the Shona and inspiring them to fight against the British. She used her spiritual authority to rally warriors and coordinate attacks. She was a symbol of resistance and hope, promising that the ancestral spirits would protect the people and ensure victory. Nehanda's leadership was both spiritual and practical, as she advised on military strategy and encouraged her followers to remain steadfast. Kaguvi was another influential spirit medium associated with the Shona people. He was believed to be possessed by the spirit of Kaguvi, a legendary figure in Shona tradition. Role in the uprising. Kaguvi worked alongside Nehanda to mobilize the Shona and coordinate resistance efforts. He emphasized the spiritual dimension of the struggle, assuring the people that the ancestors were on their side. Kaguvi's presence helped to legitimize the uprising and strengthen the resolve of the fighters. Key events. During the uprising, initial successes. The Shona and Ndebele achieved significant early successes, capturing forts, killing European settlers, and disrupting BSAC operations. The rebels used guerrilla tactics, taking advantage of their knowledge of the terrain. British response. The British responded with brutal force, deploying troops and using scorched earth tactics to crush the rebellion. They targeted spiritual leaders like Nehanda and Kaguvi, recognizing their importance in sustaining the uprising. Capture and execution of Nehanda and Kaguvi. In 1897, Nehanda and Kaguvi were captured by British forces. They were tried and sentenced to death for their roles in the uprising. Despite being offered clemency in exchange for renouncing their beliefs, both leaders refused and were executed. Their deaths marked the end of the organized resistance. Legacy of the Chimurenga Uprising, symbol of resistance. The Chimurenga Uprising became a symbol of resistance against colonial oppression and inspired later struggles for independence, including the Second Chimurenga, 1960s to 1970s, which led to Zimbabwe's independence in 1980. Nehanda and Kaguvi, as national heroes, Nehanda and Kaguvi are celebrated as national heroes in Zimbabwe. Their bravery and sacrifice are remembered as a testament to the resilience and determination of the Shona and Ndebele people. Cultural and spiritual revival. The uprising reinforced the importance of traditional spiritual beliefs and cultural practices in the fight against colonialism. It highlighted the role of ancestral spirits in uniting and empowering the people. Summary conclusion. The Shona people's resentment toward British rule was driven by a combination of land dispossession, forced labor, cultural disruption, economic exploitation, violence, and loss of sovereignty. These grievances, compounded by the inspirational leadership of figures like Nehanda and Kaguvi, culminated in the Chimurenga Uprising, a powerful expression of resistance against colonial oppression. Key figures in the rebellion included the spiritual leaders Nehanda Nyakasikana and Kaguvi, who played pivotal roles in mobilizing and inspiring their people. The uprising remains a defining moment in Zimbabwe's history, symbolizing the struggle for freedom, dignity, and self-determination. The Chimurenga Uprising was a defining moment in Zimbabwe's history, marking the first major organized resistance against British colonial rule. The leadership of Nehanda Nyakasikana and Kaguvi was instrumental in mobilizing the Shona and Ndebele people and sustaining their fight for freedom. Their legacy continues to inspire Zimbabweans and serves as a reminder of the power of unity, spirituality, and resistance in the face of oppression. For today, we end here. Meet you next time as we explore the history of the Shona peoples and the effects of colonialism.